Jungkook unexpectedly meets Taehyung's mysterious candidate. What he says next shocks everyone and drives Taehyung to storm out in fury. "You really think he is the one?" Jungkook's voice sliced through the low hum of the private room, sharp and cold, eyes narrowing as he looked past Taehyung and into the quiet man seated beside him. The wineglass in Taehyung's hand trembled, its stem nearly cracking under the pressure of his grip. He hadn't expected Jungkook to show up uninvited. He hadn't expected him to speak first. Either not with that tone, not with those eyes. The dim lighting of the rooftop lounge flickered off the amber hue of the city skyline. But inside, everything froze. Conversations around them softened into a blur as tension formed a choking silence between the three men. The candidate dressed immaculately in a dark suit, his features calm but unreadable, shifted slightly but didn't speak. He knew he wasn't the one being tested here. Taehyung stood slowly, the scraping of his chair loud in the heavy air. "You're out of line, Jungkook." But Jungkook didn't flinch. His gaze was fixed like stone. "No, I'm not," he said, voice low. "You've kept your feelings buried for years, and now you're handing them over to someone who doesn't even look at you the way you deserve to be seen." The candidate's eyes flicked toward Taehyung in measured calm, then back to Jungkook. "You don't even know me," he said quietly. Jungkook's laugh was dry. "You're right, but I know him, and he's not someone you just try on like a tailored suit." "Stop." Taehyung's voice cracked. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was jagged, filled with the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. Jungkook stood too now, slowly, deliberately. "You're chasing peace, Tae. I get it, but don't confuse safety with love." Taehyung stared at him, jaw clenched, and for a moment something vulnerable flickered behind his sharp eyes, hurt, maybe even guilt. "This isn't about love. Then why does it feel like betrayal?" Jungkook asked. That was the moment Taehyung snapped. He slammed the wineglass down onto the table, liquid splashing, glass shattering, and without a word, turned and walked out. The slam of the heavy door echoed like a gavel, final and furious. Jungkook didn't follow. He stood there, chest rising slowly, regret already blooming beneath the anger that had carried him here. The man in the suit finally stood as well, unruffled, expression unreadable. "I don't know what history you two have," he said softly, "but if it's that deep, maybe you should have said this all before I got here." Jungkook looked at him. "I tried." The man nodded. "Too late then." He turned and left too, leaving Jungkook alone amidst the broken glass and fading heat of confrontation. The night pressed in, but the memory of Taehyung's expression that barely contained tremble beneath his calm stayed with him, haunted him. Back in the hallway, Taehyung's footsteps echoed down the stairs. He wasn't running from the man he'd brought to meet his friends. He was running from the way Jungkook had made him feel, from the truth he had refused to let rise for years. From the part of him that still reacted to Jungkook like gravity pulling a tide. He paused only once at the stairwell mirror, breath shallow. His reflection looked unfamiliar, not because of the suit or the neatness of his hair, but because he looked like someone who had just been seen. Really, painfully, deeply seen. And he didn't know if he was ready for that. Not from Jungkook. Not now. Not when it was too late. Or was it? As the elevator doors closed behind him, Taehyung exhaled through his nose, sharp and quiet. Behind him, up on the rooftop, Jungkook stood in silence. He hadn't come to ruin anything. He came because something inside him had been screaming ever since he heard the name of Taehyung's candidate whispered through staff, trailing from planning meetings, mentioned in passing by stylists who didn't realize Jungkook was within earshot. At first, Jungkook hadn't cared. He tried not to care, but it was the way Taehyung stopped looking at him when they talked. The way he smiled a little less. The way he suddenly started showing up late to rehearsals with his phone always on vibrate, always glancing at it when he thought no one noticed. But Jungkook noticed, because Taehyung was always the one person he couldn't stop noticing. The rooftop air grew colder. The city lights blurred with distance. Jungkook stayed still, hands in his jacket pockets, mind worrying with things he should have said differently. Softer, smarter. But he had said what mattered, and the damage, if it was damage, had already been done. Across the city, Taehyung entered his apartment and leaned against the closed door, breathing like he'd run a marathon. He slid down until he sat on the floor, legs drawn to his chest. He didn't text the candidate, didn't apologize, He just stared at the screen of his phone. The name Jungkook glowed faintly in his recent calls. Unanswered, unsent, and yet, echoing louder than anything. Tomorrow, the world would ask why Taehyung left the dinner early, why the candidate unfollowed Jungkook minutes after, why fans noticed tension in the next group interaction. But tonight, only 2 people knew the truth. This wasn't about a date. This was about what had always remained unsaid until it hurt too much to stay silent, and too late to undo. The air outside was crisp, the kind of cold that sliced through even the thickest coat and settled into the bones. Taehyung didn't bother taking off his shoes when he got inside. He just sat there against the door, knees pulled up, jacket still on, eyes fixed on the ceiling but not seeing anything at all. The silence in his apartment was deafening. No music, no notifications. Just the pounding in his chest and the fragments of Jungkook's voice still ringing in his ears. You're chasing peace, Tae, but don't confuse safety with love. That sentence. That goddamn sentence. He had worked so hard to curate a life of calm. A life where feelings were measured, where chaos didn't erupt every time the wind changed. A life that didn't have Jungkook's unpredictable firestorm in the middle of it. And yet now, in this carefully constructed stillness, all he could think of was the fire he'd spent years trying to extinguish. He didn't know how long he sat there. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. But when his phone finally buzzed, he flinched like it had screamed. He looked at it cautiously. It wasn't Jungkook. It was the candidate. His name lit up on the screen like a reminder of everything Taehyung was supposed to be doing right now. Reassuring, explaining, holding on to something that looked good on paper. He didn't answer. He tossed the phone onto the couch and stood up slowly, legs stiff. He walked to the kitchen out of habit, opened the fridge, closed it again. Everything felt hollow. The walls felt too wide, the silence too sharp. He grabbed a glass, filled it with water, and leaned against the counter. The city below blinked with 1,000 stories that didn't involve him. But his story, this story, kept pulling him back into a memory he had no right to revisit. Jungkook's eyes. Jungkook's voice. Jungkook's hurt. He didn't want to admit it, but seeing him tonight had felt like a wound reopening. And not because Jungkook was wrong. No, because he wasn't. Across town, Jungkook sat in his car, the driver long dismissed. He hadn't moved in almost half an hour. The dashboard glowed softly in the dark, and his hands rested motionless on the steering wheel. He could still smell Taehyung's cologne, subtle, warm, lingering in the fabric of his jacket from that brief moment they passed too close. Jungkook wasn't sure what reaction he expected when he spoke those words. A fight, maybe, but not Taehyung storming out, not the glass, not the silence that followed like a graveyard. He leaned his head back and exhaled through his nose. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. They were supposed to finally talk times about everything they'd been pretending didn't matter. About the looks that lasted too long. The accidental touches that lingered. The silence that always felt heavier between them than with anyone else. But instead, all they'd done was bleed on the floor of a rooftop restaurant. He closed his eyes. Thought about how this all started. Years ago. A stupid after-party, too much wine, a glance held too long, a dare disguised as a joke. And then Jungkook had kissed him. Or maybe Taehyung kissed him. They never agreed on that part. But what followed was months of half-finished moments, late-night walks, fingers brushing, unspoken promises buried under fear. They never defined it. They never ended it. And maybe that was the problem. Taehyung had chosen safety, a candidate with no history, no fire, no unfinished chapters. Someone new, someone uncomplicated. Jungkook's phone buzzed beside him. He looked. Not Taehyung. He didn't know what he would have done if at times had times been him. He started the car, hands shaky, and drove without thinking. The streets blurred past. But his mind stayed stuck in that moment. Taehyung's glass hitting the table, the look in his eyes, the sound of the door slamming shut. By the time he reached the river, the sky had started to lighten with dawn. He parked again, this time near the bridge, and got out. The air was freezing, biting at his skin, but he didn't care. He walked slowly to the railing and stared out at the water. Everything was still. The world was beginning to wake up, but his mind refused to leave that rooftop. Somewhere in the distance, a train rumbled, loud and slow. Jungkook closed his eyes again. Why did you come? Taehyung's voice from hours ago whispered back to him, not angry, just tired. Because I couldn't watch you lie to yourself. He hadn't meant to sound cruel. He just couldn't keep pretending he didn't care. His breath came out in clouds. A few blocks away, Taehyung was standing in front of the mirror in his bathroom, toothbrush in hand, but unmoving. He stared at his own eyes, trying to find answers in them. He was exhausted, but wired. The kind of mental state that came from emotional whiplash. He had been ready to introduce someone new into his life. Someone stable. Someone who didn't leave him wondering what each look meant. Someone who didn't haunt his songs, his dreams, his silence. But then Jungkook showed up and shattered everything. And it wasn't fair, because Jungkook wasn't supposed to have this kind of power over him anymore. Taehyung finished brushing his teeth and splashed water on his face, letting it drip onto the counter. He stood there, dripping and hollow, then grabbed his towel and pressed it to his face. For a second he wanted to scream, but instead he whispered, "Damn you, Jungkook." He didn't know if it was a curse or a plea. He didn't know what he wanted anymore. Later that day, they were scheduled to appear together on a group shoot. Nothing too intimate, just a media campaign. Still, it felt like a trap. Jungkook was already in the makeup chair when Taehyung arrived. Their eyes met in the mirror. It was only for a second, but the tension that filled the room was instant and suffocating. Staff glanced at each other nervously. Someone coughed. Another person dropped a brush. Jungkook looked away first. Taehyung sat in silence as his stylist worked around him. His phone buzzed again, probably the candidate. He didn't look. He didn't want to. During the shoot, they stood at opposite ends, smiled when prompted, posed like professionals. But something between them crackled under the surface. Impossible to ignore. Photographers picked up on it. So did the fans. By the time the first teasers dropped that night, ARMY had already flooded comment sections with, "Why do they look so cold?" and "Did something happen between Taekook?" Jungkook was the first to leave. He didn't say goodbye. Taehyung lingered, fingers still adjusting the cuff of his coat long after everyone else had gone. Then, without fully realizing it, he texted, "Is greater than, are you home?" It wasn't clear if he meant to ask. But the message sent, and minutes later, 3 dots appeared. Jungkook was typing. Then it stopped. Then again. And finally, "Is greater than, yeah." Taehyung stared at it. Then his fingers moved. "Is greater than, can I come over?" This time the reply came instantly. "Is groter dan." Doors open. He didn't bring anything. No explanation, no words rehearsed. Just a hoodie, cap, and shaking hands. When Jungkook opened the door, they just stood there for a beat. Taehyung looked down at his feet. "I wasn't ready for what you said." Jungkook didn't speak. Taehyung stepped in slowly, closing the door behind him. "I still don't know what I want, but I know last night I didn't want you to leave, even if I acted like I did." Jungkook leaned against the wall, eyes following him. "You were right. About peace and safety. I've been chasing things that looked like love, because love scares the hell out of me." Jungkook's voice was quiet, steady. "I scare you?" Taehyung met his eyes. "You always have." The silence after that was different, heavier, but filled with truth. They didn't touch, didn't embrace, but the wall between them had cracked. And the pieces were finally falling in a way that felt like beginning again, not from scratch, but from the part of the story they had both tried to bury. The next morning, the world still buzzed with speculation. Headlines about tension, rumors about drama, but neither of them cared. Because for the first time in years, Jungkook and Taehyung were finally looking at each other without armor, and that was more terrifying and beautiful than anything else. Under the quiet hum of Jungkook's apartment heater, the morning light filtered through the half-open blinds like faded golden threads. Taehyung sat at the edge of the couch, hunched over with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped tightly, as if trying to keep himself from falling apart. Jungkook leaned against the kitchen doorway, a mug in his hand, untouched. His eyes never left Taehyung. The silence wasn't awkward anymore, it was cautious, charged, like 2 tectonic plates shifting under the weight of something inevitable. Neither of them had slept. The night had passed in slow breaths and glances, in words that hovered in the air but were never spoken. They didn't touch. They didn't ask the questions they weren't ready to answer, but they stayed, And somehow that was enough to shatter years of pretending. Jungkook finally spoke, his voice low, a rasp from exhaustion and restraint. Did he know? Taehyung didn't look up. About us? His thumb rubbed against his palm in slow circles. He asked. Once. Jungkook swallowed hard. What did you say? I lied, Taehyung said, voice barely audible. I told him there was nothing. Jungkook exhaled, but it wasn't relief. It was pain. A tired ache that sat deep in his chest. You didn't have to lie. Taehyung finally looked at him, eyes bloodshot, jaw tense. You think I wanted to? Do you have any idea how hard it is to keep erasing someone who never leaves your head? Jungkook placed the mug down gently on the table beside him and moved forward, step by step, until he stood right in front of Taehyung. Then why did you? Taehyung stood slowly, standing toe-to-toe with him, breathing uneven. Because I didn't know how to survive if I didn't. Jungkook's hands twitched at his sides, wanting to reach out, wanting to close the space that had stretched too wide for too long. You think I've been surviving? Taehyung's voice cracked. I didn't know you were drowning too. I was, Jungkook whispered. Still am. They stood there for a long moment, too many emotions fighting for space between them. Grief, regret, longing, and underneath it all, something raw and unspeakable. Jungkook's voice was barely more than a breath. I never moved on, Tae. Taehyung looked at him like he didn't deserve those words, like hearing them hurt more than being hated. You should have. I tried, Jungkook admitted. But no one looked at me the way you did. No one made silence feel like music. No one else felt like home. Taehyung's throat worked as he tried to hold back the tears burning behind his eyes. Why now? Because I saw him, Jungkook said, with no venom, only honesty. And it hit me that if I didn't say something, you'd disappear behind a smile that wasn't real. And I couldn't live with that. Taehyung turned away, running a hand through his hair. He walked toward the window, leaned both hands on the sill, and stared out at the morning city. I wanted something simple. You were never meant for simple, Jungkook said behind him. You were meant for real. Taehyung closed his eyes. But real hurts. Yeah, Jungkook said. It does. They didn't speak for a long while. The sounds of the city filtered in a siren in the distance, a dog barking, someone yelling about coffee. But inside, it was just them, wrapped in a quiet that felt more intimate than any touch. Taehyung finally turned back, arms crossed over his chest like a shield. What do you want from me, Jungkook? Jungkook didn't hesitate. The truth. Taehyung looked away again. You're asking for a lot. I'm not asking for forever, Jungkook said. I'm asking for times right now, asterisk. For honesty, just for once. Taehyung walked back to the center of the room, slow, careful. His voice trembled. I still love you. The words landed like thunder between them. Jungkook didn't move, didn't blink. Taehyung swallowed. There, you have it. The truth. Jungkook took one step forward. Say it again. Taehyung shook his head. Don't do this. Say it. Taehyung looked at him, his eyes wide, voice breaking. I still love you. Jungkook closed the distance between them in one breath. One blink, one heartbeat. His hands reached up, touched Taehyung's face gently, reverently, as if he was afraid he might disappear. Taehyung leaned into the touch like he'd been starved for it. And when Jungkook finally kissed him, it wasn't desperate or rushed. It was slow, painful, healing, a kiss that carried every word they'd never said. Every night they'd spent apart pretending they didn't care. Every second they'd wasted chasing peace when what they needed was each other. When they pulled apart, their foreheads rested together, breath mingling. Taehyung whispered, What now? Jungkook smiled, bittersweet. Now we figure it out. Together. Taehyung's arms wrapped around him, holding him close, anchoring them both. Later, they sat on the floor, backs against the couch, fingers tangled like lifelines. Jungkook told him about the nights he couldn't sleep without playing Taehyung's old voicemails. Taehyung admitted he still kept the hoodie Jungkook had left behind 3 years ago, tucked in the back of his closet like a secret. They laughed. They cried. They sat in silence. They started Again. But the world outside didn't pause. The candidate released a statement the next day, brief and respectful, confirming the end of any romantic pursuit with Taehyung. No malice, just clarity. And the fans did what fans always did. Speculated, theorized, screamed in comment sections. But none of it mattered. Because for once, Taehyung and Jungkook didn't live for the headlines. They lived for the moments between them. The small ones, the private ones. The mornings where neither of them said much but stayed close. The nights when music filled the room and memories danced with their laughter. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be honest. And that, finally, was enough. Jungkook leaned back against the couch, letting out a breath that felt like it had been trapped inside him for years. His eyes drifted to Taehyung's profile. Sharp cheekbones softened by the morning light, lips parted just slightly, hair falling messily over his forehead. This wasn't the carefully curated version of Taehyung the world was used to. This was the version Jungkook remembered waking up next to, years ago. Back when they didn't know how complicated everything would get. "I don't know what to do with this," Jungkook said quietly. Taehyung's head turned, brows furrowing gently. "With what?" Jungkook glanced down at their joined hands. "With the fact that we're finally here, saying the things we never said, and it feels like I'm waiting for the floor to drop." Taehyung sighed, closing his eyes briefly. "I feel the same." They sat with it, two men who had spent too long avoiding the gravity of their connection now suspended in the aftermath of truth. Taehyung's thumb stilled on Jungkook's skin. "Do you remember Jeju?" he asked suddenly, voice softer than breath. Jungkook turned to him. "How could I forget? It was raining." Taehyung smiled faintly. "You were complaining the whole hike up the mountain. Said your shoes weren't made for mud." "They weren't," Jungkook chuckled. "I almost lost one to that stupid stream." Taehyung laughed, but the sound faded quickly. "You kissed me that night, under that broken umbrella." Jungkook's smile faltered. "Yeah, I didn't sleep at all after that. I kept thinking, we'll talk about it tomorrow. But tomorrow never came." Jungkook looked down. "I was scared." "So was I." The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was mutual understanding, the recognition of shared blame, of wounds left unattended. Jungkook's fingers tightened slightly. "Do you regret it?" Taehyung asked. Jungkook shook his head. "I regret not fighting harder, not asking you to choose me when it still mattered." Taehyung looked away, the sting of those words sharp even though they weren't meant to hurt. "I thought I did the right thing, letting go before we destroyed each other." "And did we?" Jungkook asked, voice low. "Destroy each other?" Taehyung's throat tightened. Almost. The room was growing brighter, but neither of them moved. Time had warped memories folding into the present, shaping the conversation with echoes of moments long buried. Jungkook stood slowly, pulling Taehyung with him. They faced each other in the center of the room, standing in bare feet and worn clothes, stripped of pretense. "We're not who we were back then," Jungkook said. "We've grown, changed." Taehyung nodded. "But I still remember how it felt, to want you." "And now?" Taehyung met his gaze. "Now, I need to learn how to trust it again." Jungkook stepped closer, their chests nearly touching. "Then let's start small. No promises. Just mornings like this." Taehyung's hand lifted to rest over Jungkook's heart. One morning at a time. The day continued with quiet normalcy, breakfast shared in mismatched bowls, music playing softly in the background, a few exchanged glances that said far more than words. Jungkook moved around the kitchen with ease, and Taehyung watched him like he was trying to memorize every motion. The comfort, the warmth, the small, domestic rituals they had once dreamed about now unfolding like a secret whispered back to them after years of silence. Later, Jungkook sat by the window sketching, and Taehyung curled beside him with a book he didn't read. Their bodies leaned into each other naturally, like puzzle pieces long misplaced but finally found. The city moved on outside, cars honked, people rushed, but in that apartment, time slowed. But not everything could be paused. By evening, messages had piled up on both their phones. Manager texts, agency inquiries, PR flags about the candidate's statement, Jungkook's unexpected presence at the dinner. The tension caught on film during the shoot. Their names were trending again. Not for music, not for performance, but for them. Taehyung's chest tightened as he scrolled through the headlines. He placed his phone face down. I hate this part, he whispered. Jungkook reached for him. Then let's not look. Taehyung shook his head. We can't ignore it forever. Jungkook leaned in. Maybe not. But we don't owe anyone an explanation. Not yet. The question hovered unsaid. Will we ever? Taehyung looked at him. Are we doing this for real, Kook? Jungkook's fingers brushed his cheek. I don't know what real looks like. But I want this. You. Whatever it means.
Taehyung closed his eyes. Then let's be careful. I can't survive breaking like that again. Jungkook kissed his forehead. We take it slow. That night they lay in the same bed but on opposite sides. Not out of distance but respect. The space between them was filled with potential, not tension. And sometime past midnight, when the city's sounds had dulled into a hush, Taehyung rolled over and whispered, Are you awake? Jungkook's voice came back immediately. Yeah. Taehyung reached across the sheets, searching blindly until his fingers found Jungkook. They fell asleep like that, hands entwined, hearts tentative but finally facing the same direction. In the days that followed, they navigated their new reality with caution. Work called them apart, but their nights remained theirs. Jungkook started leaving his jacket on Taehyung's chair. Taehyung began keeping 2 mugs by the sink. It wasn't declaration. It was quiet integration. They didn't speak about the media. They didn't explain the subtle shift fans were already picking up on. But when Jungkook released a cover of a love song and fans noticed a faint laugh at the end that sounded suspiciously like Taehyung, the internet exploded. Still, they said nothing. Because love, this time, didn't need to be loud. One night, weeks later, as they sat watching a film neither of them were really focused on, Taehyung turned to Jungkook and asked, Do you ever think about what we missed? Jungkook paused before answering, All the time. And does it make you sad? Jungkook looked at him. No, it makes me grateful we still have time. Taehyung smiled, small and real. They didn't need to catch up to the past. They just had to hold on to now. And maybe, just maybe, this time they wouldn't let go. The night air drifted through the open window, cool and fragrant with spring, rustling the sheer curtains like soft whispers. Taehyung was quiet, his back against the headboard, knees drawn loosely toward his chest, one hand holding the corner of the blanket while the other absently traced over the edge of his phone. Jungkook sat cross-legged at the end of the bed, chin resting in his palm as he studied the silhouette in front of him. They had come far in such a short span of days, too far maybe. What once had been years of guarded silences and carefully avoided truths was now replaced by a fragile intimacy neither of them dared define. There were no grand confessions, no bold declarations to the world, just glances across morning coffee, a touch at the door, an exhale that came a little easier when the other was in the room. Jungkook reached for the remote and lowered the volume of the drama playing on the television. The actors' voices faded into a soft murmur. You've been quiet tonight, he said. Taehyung nodded once, still staring at the screen without watching, just thinking. About us, Taehyung murmured, eyes unfocused. What this is, what it might become. Jungkook shifted, drawing closer, the bed creaking slightly beneath his movement. And I'm terrified, Taehyung admitted, his voice catching. Jungkook's hand reached for his, warm and grounding. Of what? Of getting used to this, Taehyung said, finally turning toward him. Of letting myself believe it's safe, and then losing it again. Jungkook didn't flinch, he understood. You're not the only one scared. Taehyung searched his eyes. Then why does this feel like free-falling? Because we're finally not pretending anymore, Jungkook whispered. And that's always terrifying. Taehyung's fingers tightened around his. What if we break it again? Then we rebuild, Jungkook replied. But this time we don't walk away so easily. The sincerity in his voice settled over the room like a vow. Taehyung inhaled deeply, the knot in his chest loosening just a little. They didn't need promises carved in stone, just the willingness to try again and again. Later that night, when both had slipped beneath the sheets, neither said good night. Instead, Jungkook reached out wordlessly, fingers brushing Taehyung's wrist. Taehyung turned toward him, their foreheads meeting in the hush of a shared breath. They stayed like that until sleep claimed them, not needing anything more than the steady heartbeat between them. But love, even the quiet kind, could not remain hidden forever. The next morning, Taehyung's phone buzzed relentlessly. His manager, a media rep, a PR handler. Jungkook's phone mirrored the chaos. Someone had leaked a photo, grainy but unmistakable. Two silhouettes at a window, one leaning into the other, a hand touching a jaw. They stared at the image in stunned silence. "It's not even clear," Jungkook said finally, jaw tight. "Could be anyone." Taehyung's shoulders sank. "But it's not, and they'll know." "Let them." Taehyung looked at him, startled. "What?" "I'm tired of hiding in shadows that don't even protect us," Jungkook said. "If this is the start of something real, I'm not going to deny it." Taehyung's throat tightened. "You'd really?" Jungkook nodded. "For you, yes." And just like that, the fear didn't vanish. But it shifted. It no longer held them hostage. It became a compass, something to guide them toward what mattered. That evening, as the internet buzzed and speculation ran wild, Taehyung posted a photo to his private story. A simple one. A window, 2 mugs of tea, no faces, no captions, just light falling across 2 lives that were slowly learning how to exist again in tandem. And Jungkook, minutes later, posted a photo of the night sky, captioned with a single word. Finally. The fandom didn't explode, it erupted. Armies dissected every pixel, every angle, every timestamp. Some celebrated, others speculated. A few recoiled. But for Jungkook and Taehyung, the noise faded behind the clarity of what they had chosen. Over the next few weeks, their schedules grew relentless again, interviews, recordings, rehearsals. But this time, they moved through it with an unspoken thread connecting them. Glances across dressing rooms, shared water bottles, a hand brushing lower backs when cameras weren't looking. But not everything was easy. There were tensions backstage, whispers, a conversation with HYBE's PR team that left Taehyung's expression unreadable and Jungkook packing a hallway for hours after. A statement drafted but never released. A scheduled appearance mysteriously canceled last minute. One night after a particularly difficult meeting, Taehyung returned to Jungkook's apartment wordlessly. He dropped his bag by the door, removed his jacket, and stood still in the middle of the living room, hands clenched. Jungkook watched him from the kitchen, brow furrowed. Taehyung's voice broke. "I'm so tired of explaining myself." "You don't have to," Jungkook said, walking over. "I do," Taehyung said, turning to him. "To managers, to press, to fans, to people who think they know me, to people who love the version of me that didn't come with this complication." Jungkook cupped his face gently. "You don't owe anyone your truth except yourself." Taehyung's eyes brimmed. "What if my truth costs everything?" Jungkook didn't hesitate. "Then we rebuild again, together." That night they lay on the floor of the living room, no music, no television. Just the buzz of the city and the steady thrum of 2 hearts daring to remain open. In the months that followed, things didn't get easier, but they got stronger. They had disagreements, old wounds resurfaced. There were days Taehyung didn't reply to Jungkook's messages for hours, needing space to breathe. There were nights Jungkook stayed at the studio too long, unsure how to balance everything. But they kept showing up. They cooked together on Sundays. Taehyung introduced Jungkook to the abstract jazz albums he loved. Jungkook taught Taehyung how to fly drones. They laughed. They argued. They kissed in the quiet hours between sunrise and responsibility. One afternoon, as they sat on a bench overlooking the river, Taehyung turned to Jungkook with a faint smile. "Do you think we would have survived if we got it right the first time?" Jungkook considered it, maybe not. Why? Because we didn't know how to hold each other then, Jungkook said. Not really. We held the idea of us, not the weight. Taehyung nodded. Now we know the weight. Jungkook reached over, linking their pinkies together, and we still choose it. Taehyung rested his head on Jungkook's shoulder. Their phones buzzed in their pockets, emails, press notes, the world always spinning. But for a moment, they let it all fade. Because this time, love wasn't chaos. It was choosing each other through the chaos. Again and again. Without apology. Under the muted golden hue of a dying afternoon, their footsteps echoed along the riverwalk, soft and syncopated. Taehyung's hand lingered near Jungkook. Close enough to feel the warmth radiating off his skin, but not quite touching. There was an understanding in the silence between them now, a peace they hadn't known before, though it didn't come without fragility. Each moment was a thread, carefully woven to hold together what had once been torn. They stopped near the bench again, the one they'd returned to a few times since that night, since the photo, since the quiet unraveling of everything they thought they had buried. Jungkook sat first, brushing his hand across the worn wood before sinking down, elbows on his knees, face tilted to the river. Taehyung joined him a second later, his shoulder grazing Jungkook's just slightly. The wind tugged at the edge of his coat and carried with it the scent of approaching rain. I keep waiting for something to go wrong, Jungkook said, his voice low and steady, like he wasn't entirely sure if he wanted an answer. Taehyung didn't answer right away. His gaze followed a child chasing a red balloon down the path, her laugh unbothered by the world around her. He wondered what it would feel like to live like that again, to laugh without weight. It already did, he finally said. Everything already fell apart once. Jungkook turned to look at him, eyes searching. But we're still here, Taehyung added. That has to count for something. It does, Jungkook replied. It counts for everything. They sat there for a while longer, not saying much, letting the late light pour over them like forgiveness. It felt strange to admit it, but this quiet, with all its discomfort, all its simplicity, was beginning to feel like home. Not the place, but the presence, the air around them. Later that evening, the rain did come, soft at first and then faster, more urgent. Jungkook pulled Taehyung under the awning of a closed bookstore, laughing as they ducked out of the downpour, shoulders bumping. Taehyung wiped droplets from his cheeks and shook his head, his hair curling slightly from the humidity. We used to do this all the time. Get caught in the rain. Yeah, Taehyung's eyes flicked up to meet his. You always hated it, said your boots weren't waterproof. Jungkook laughed, leaning back against the wall. Maybe I was just trying to have a reason to complain so you'd pay attention to me. Taehyung arched a brow, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You didn't need to try that hard. Something in the space between them shifted then, something quiet but undeniable. Jungkook reached out, brushed a drop of rain from Taehyung's collarbone with the back of his fingers, lingering just a second too long. Taehyung didn't move. Are you happy? Jungkook asked. The question landed like a stone in a still pond. Taehyung looked at him, really looked, and the weight of years passed between them in a single breath. I think I'm learning how to be, he said. With you, I'm learning. Jungkook's hand fell, but his eyes didn't leave Taehyung. Then let me keep trying. Let me be someone who adds to your peace, not your silence. That night back at Jungkook's apartment, they dried off and changed into old clothes, Taehyung in a shirt far too big, sleeves falling over his hands, Jungkook in sweatpants and a hoodie that still smelled faintly of his cologne. They sat cross-legged on the floor with takeout spread between them, a candle flickering nearby more for comfort than light. The mood was soft, unrushed. As they ate, they talked, not just about them, but about everything they hadn't dared to share before. Childhood fears, career pressures, the burden of being known by millions and yet misunderstood by the one person they needed to understand them the most. Jungkook admitted he sometimes still felt like a kid pretending to be okay. Taehyung confessed that even on stage, surrounded by adoration, he often felt alone. Jungkook reached for his hand then, not out of pity, but out of recognition. "I get it," he said. "You don't have to explain it to me." And Taehyung's grip tightened in return, not with desperation but gratitude. The days blurred into weeks. Slowly, cautiously, they built something real, small bricks of honesty and shared mornings, of tension navigated instead of avoided, of affection expressed without fear. They weren't hiding anymore. Not entirely. They were just choosing what to protect and what to let the world see. The candidate Taehyung had once considered continued to be a ghost of the past. Polite messages, a clean exit, no bitterness. But the contrast between what could have been and what was now had never felt starker. Taehyung never mentioned him again, and Jungkook never asked. Instead, they focused on now. They learned how to argue, how to sit in silence without assuming it meant something bad, how to support each other without crowding the other's space. Jungkook brought Taehyung herbal tea when he had trouble sleeping. Taehyung made Jungkook playlists of songs that reminded him of their shared laughter. They learned to speak a new language with their eyes, their hands, their breath. And still the world watched. Paparazzi snapped photos, fans speculated, analysts on talk shows dissected their movements. But this time, neither of them flinched. Neither of them broke under the weight of attention, because they had something no one else could touch. One night after a show, Taehyung stood backstage with a towel around his neck, sweat glistening on his skin, chest rising and falling with adrenaline. Jungkook came up behind him, reached for his wrist, and pulled him into a quiet corner. Without a word, he kissed him. Slow, sure, with the certainty of someone who had spent years learning the outline of a heart they thought they'd never be allowed to hold again. And Taehyung kissed him back, not because the moment demanded it, but because his heart had already leapt far ahead of him. Neither of them noticed the camera lens hidden behind the scaffolding. When the photo leaked the next day, it was everywhere. A kiss, clear, undeniable. The internet split open. Some celebrated, others condemned. A few screamed betrayal. But for the first time, Jungkook and Taehyung didn't retreat. They didn't hide. They stood together in a quiet room, watching their phones light up with messages from management, from family, from fans, and said nothing. They didn't need to. The next day, Taehyung posted a single sentence on his feed. "Love in all forms is still love." Jungkook followed with a photo of Taehyung's hand in his, captioned with one word. "Always." And with that, the chapter they had feared for so long, the one built on denial and secrecy, was closed. What opened in its place was messy, loud, imperfect. But it was theirs. And for the first time in years, they weren't just surviving it. They were living it. The morning after the kiss was everywhere. The sun broke across Seoul with a strange stillness, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Inside Jungkook's apartment, the curtains were drawn, but the world had already entered. Notifications bled endlessly across their phones, vibrations like tiny earthquakes rolling through the silence. And yet between the folds of tangled sheets and the weight of a heavy duvet, Taehyung stirred only slightly, his arm draped loosely over Jungkook's bare chest, eyes still closed, lips parted in sleep. Jungkook had been awake for hours, not out of fear. He no longer felt fear the same way. What surged through him now was anticipation, the quiet knowing that life had been divided by a single moment. Before, they were speculation. After, they were real, unavoidable, irrevocable. He reached up and gently brushed a strand of hair away from Taehyung's forehead, careful not to wake him. The intimacy of that small motion, after all they had endured, felt holy. Taehyung's eyelashes fluttered. "You're starring," he mumbled, voice hoarse with sleep. Jungkook smiled. "I like what I see." Taehyung cracked one eye open and groaned dramatically, burying his face into Jungkook's shoulder. "Don't flirt. We might be in the middle of being cancelled." Jungkook's hand moved up and down Taehyung's back. Let them cancel me. Taehyung lifted his head. Don't say that. Why not? Because you mean it, Taehyung said, blinking slowly. And that scares me. Jungkook was quiet for a beat. I'd lose the world for you, but I don't want to. I want us to live in it, out loud. Taehyung sat up slightly, resting on his elbow, the sheets sliding down to his waist. His hair was messy, his expression unreadable. I thought I'd feel guilt, panic, but all I feel is stillness. That's a good thing, Jungkook murmured. Maybe, Taehyung whispered, but stillness always comes before a storm. The storm arrived by noon. HYBE called an emergency meeting. There were discussions about damage control, about sponsorship risks, about narrative direction. Jungkook and Taehyung were summoned separately, each flanked by their own managers. Each asked the same questions in different rooms with cold coffee and tighter smiles. Was it real? Was it serious? Was it a mistake? Jungkook didn't flinch. It's not a mistake, he said. I love him. Taehyung hesitated, but not because he doubted it. I didn't plan for this, he said, but I won't lie about it anymore. There was silence, then tension, then paperwork and offers to pause the noise, to release joint statements that reframed the narrative, painted it as experimental, misinterpreted, exaggerated. There was an option for denial. They declined. And just like that, they crossed a line the industry rarely forgave. News outlets churned out endless coverage. International headlines speculated on the end of the perfect image, while some praised their courage, calling it a cultural shift, a rebellion against silence. Others were cruel, venomous, ripping through them with righteous indignation and thinly veiled bigotry. Their families reached out. Taehyung's mother called in tears, not of disappointment but of fear. They'll try to break you, she said. Promise me you'll hold on. Jungkook's brother sent a single message. I'm proud of you, whatever comes next. Taehyung retreated to his studio for a few days. Not because he wanted distance, but because he needed space to think, to breathe, to remember that he existed outside the lens. Jungkook sent food, left voice notes, didn't push. When Taehyung returned, it was past midnight. Jungkook was curled up on the couch, half asleep, wearing one of Taehyung's old hoodies. You stayed up, Taehyung said. Jungkook sat up, blinking. I wasn't sleeping well. Taehyung sat beside him, silent, stretching like a second skin. Then he spoke. I kept asking myself why I was doing this, why I couldn't just let it go again, and the answer kept coming back as your name. Jungkook turned to him. I've lived most of my life performing versions of myself, Taehyung said, voice steady. But with you, there's no performance. There's only me, and I don't want to lose that again. Jungkook reached for his hand and squeezed it. You won't. The days that followed were a blur of tension and tenderness. They walked a tightrope of being visible and staying grounded. A few brands pulled back. One international magazine canceled a cover shoot, but others stepped forward, quiet allies who believed in art over image, in truth over safety. Their music changed too. The next album, already in progress, began to shift. Lyrics grew more vulnerable, instrumentals deeper. Jungkook penned a track about hiding in plain sight. Taehyung wrote one about the sound of someone breathing beside you after years of silence. They collaborated on a piece that didn't mention love directly, but every note pulsed with it. And when they performed live for the first time after the leak, something cracked open in the crowd. There was no booing, no backlash. Just screaming. Hands held high, faces wet with tears, signs that read, "We see you and you're safe here and thank you." Taehyung stood at the edge of the stage that night, staring into a sea of lightsticks that flickered like stars, and whispered, "We thought we'd lose you." The crowd answered with a roar that shook the foundation. Backstage, Jungkook pulled him close and kissed him. There were still threats, hate mail. journalists who twisted their words, an entire gossip site dedicated to dissecting their every interaction. But slowly, something remarkable happened. The noise didn't matter as much anymore, because they were writing something louder than the headlines. A new story. Their own. They bought a house, quiet on the outskirts of the city where the world couldn't follow, where they could be just two men drinking coffee barefoot on the patio, laughing about nothing. They planted a garden, got a cat, burned toast too often and fought over grocery lists. Life, in its messy, domestic beauty, unfolded slowly. And still, they kept making music. Together, separately, always inspired. They didn't speak about their relationship in interviews unless they were asked directly, and when they were, they answered without shame. Yes, Taehyung would say, he's my person. Or Jungkook with that soft smile, he makes me better. Years passed. There were new albums, solo tour, awards, scandals, recoveries. But through it all they remained. Once during an anniversary livestream, a fan asked what love meant to them. Jungkook looked at Taehyung. Love, he said, isn't the fireworks, it's the quiet, the choosing, the staying, even when it's hard. And Taehyung, eyes soft, nodded, especially then. That night as the livestream ended, they sat together in the dark. No cameras, no audience, just them. Taehyung reached for Jungkook's hand, lacing their fingers together. And without a word, they knew. They had rewritten their story. Not perfectly, not easily, but truthfully. And that, after all this time, was enough. The moon hung low that night, casting silver light across the wooden floors of their quiet home, the shadows of leaves dancing along the curtains like memories. Taehyung stood barefoot in the kitchen, staring out the window, the steam from his untouched cup of chamomile tea curling upward like breath held too long. He didn't speak when Jungkook stepped in behind him, but his shoulders loosened the second Jungkook's arms wrapped gently around his waist. "You didn't sleep again," Jungkook whispered against his neck. Taehyung shook his head, leaning back into the warmth. "Too loud in my head." Jungkook rested his chin on his shoulder. "Tell me." Taehyung's fingers tapped against the ceramic. "It's not just us anymore. Every move we make is held under a microscope. I'm not scared of being judged. I'm scared of being misinterpreted. Like the more we speak, the less they understand." "They don't have to understand us," Jungkook murmured, tightening his hold. "We just have to be sure we understand each other." Taehyung turned slowly in his arms, eyes searching, weary. "And do we?" Jungkook's eyes softened, "More than I've ever understood anyone." A beat passed before Taehyung finally nodded and let his head rest against Jungkook's chest. The rhythm of Jungkook's heartbeat thudded steadily beneath his ear, like the only song that mattered. They stayed like that until the sun began to bleed into the horizon, coloring the sky with quiet promises of another day. That afternoon, they walked the edge of the forest behind their home, boots sinking into the damp earth, hand in hand. It was the kind of path they used to dream about, the kind of quiet that didn't demand anything of them. Birds flitted from tree to tree, and every now and then, Jungkook would glance at Taehyung, who looked more like himself here than he ever did in front of cameras. Less polished, more whole. "Do you think we'll ever be just? Jungkook and Taehyung again?" Taehyung asked, bending to touch a flower blooming at the base of an old oak. Jungkook crouched beside him. "We never stopped being them. We just forgot we didn't owe the world a performance." Taehyung looked at him with something close to awe. "How are you always so sure?" "I'm not," Jungkook replied honestly. "But when I look at you, I remember why I keep trying." There was a softness in Taehyung's eyes then, one that spoke of late nights and early mornings, of studio booths filled with silence before music, of fights that ended not in slamming doors but in quiet apologies and lingering touches. They returned home muddy and laughing, shoes left at the doorstep. Taehyung played records while Jungkook cooked, humming off-key just to make him laugh. The cat meowed lazily from the windowsill. Outside, the world spun on, chaotic and loud, but inside it was just two people rediscovering how to exist. Later that week, Jungkook released a short film, an abstract piece set to a piano score he composed himself. There were no words, only images, a hand reaching through water, a hallway lit only by a flickering bulb, a rooftop with two chairs but only one figure sitting. Taehyung appeared only at the end, silhouetted, his back to the camera as he faced the morning light. It trended in over 40 countries. Critics called it haunting. Fans cried over the intimacy, but neither of them responded to the questions that followed. They didn't need to. Their art spoke the language their hearts had always whispered. Weeks later, Taehyung stood on stage alone during a solo show, the crowd roaring his name. He paused halfway through, swallowing the emotion lodged in his throat, fingers tightening on the microphone. "There are some things you don't get to plan," he said, voice cracking slightly. "Sometimes life just finds you in the middle of pretending you're fine." He looked down, then up again, smiling. "I'm not pretending anymore." The cheers that followed shook the stadium. Backstage, Jungkook waited with a towel and a water bottle. He didn't say anything, just pulled Taehyung into his arms and held him for a long time. There was no need for words when love was written in every breath between them. Not long after, they did their first interview together since the world found out. It was soft, unpressured, filmed in the comfort of their living room with a journalist they trusted. The questions were thoughtful, and the answers came without hesitation. "How would you define your relationship now?" the interviewer asked gently. Jungkook looked at Taehyung, who smiled faintly and said, "It's not perfect, but it's honest, and we're building it together." Jungkook nodded. "We stopped trying to be a story people wanted and started living the one we needed." The interview aired the next night, and to their surprise, the response wasn't fury or scandal, but relief. Thousands of messages poured in, people who felt seen, who found courage in their honesty, who whispered thank you like a prayer. They were no longer just idols. They had become mirrors. Late one evening, long after the lights were out and the world had quieted, Jungkook sat on the balcony with a sketchpad in his lap, drawing without direction. Taehyung stepped out, blanket around his shoulders, hair a tousled mess. "You should sleep," Jungkook said, not looking up. Taehyung walked over and curled beside him on the lounge chair. "So should you." Jungkook smiled, brushing graphite across the page. "What are you drawing?" "You," Jungkook said simply, "but not how you look, how you feel." Taehyung rested his head against his shoulder. "And how do I feel?" Jungkook finally looked at him, "Like home." For a long moment, there was only the sound of wind and ink and breath. Jungkook. "Yeah." "If all of this disappeared tomorrow," Taehyung said, eyes on the stars, "the music, the fame, the world, would you regret it?" Jungkook closed his eyes. "Only if I lost you too." Taehyung reached over, lacing their fingers together. "Then let's make sure that never happens." They didn't promise forever. Forever was too uncertain, too heavy, but they promised tomorrow, and then the next, one sunrise at a time. Years later, long after the headlines faded, long after the novelty wore off, they still chose each other. In sleepy mornings and stormy nights, in burnt toast and shared playlists, in quiet conversations and loud laughter. And even when words failed, when distance or exhaustion pressed between them, they always came back to the simplest truth. That love, real love, wasn't the grand gestures or the perfect moments. It was this: choosing every day. Without apology, without fear. Just love in the form of Jungkook and Taehyung. Two names that once echoed in stadiums and now echoed in the quiet corners of a life they built with their own hands. Absolutely. Please hold while I write the next full, uninterrupted continuation of the story in immersive, cinematic English narrative prose. The emotional depth, packing, and tone will remain consistent with everything so far. No breaks, no episode or word count references, only the natural flow of the story as it develops. Writing now. Winter crept in quietly that year, not with a dramatic snowfall or a biting wind, but with a hush that softened everything it touched. The trees stood bare and motionless outside the window, the gray sky pressing low over Seoul like a held breath. Inside their home, warmth lived in the walls, in the laughter that echoed through the hallway, in the warmth of shared blankets, in the space between two pairs of hands that had learned how to hold without letting go. Taehyung stood in the middle of the living room, barefoot, wrapped in one of Jungkook's oversized sweaters that fell off one shoulder. He was holding a record in his hand, reading the back like it held secrets he hadn't yet unlocked. The scent of cinnamon lingered in the air from the bread Jungkook had pulled from the oven, slightly burnt at the edges, but made with stubborn affection. Their cat stretched out on the rug, tail flicking lazily, while soft jazz hummed through the speakers. Jungkook walked in quietly, towel around his neck, fresh from a shower, his hair damp and curling at the nape of his neck. He watched Taehyung for a moment, chest tightening at the sight, how something so still could carry so much weight. The calmness was real, but it came from struggle. Every inch of peace had been earned, and it showed in the way Taehyung turned to him, eyes steady, lips curled with the trace of a smile that wasn't for anyone but him. "You've been quiet lately," Jungkook said gently, stepping closer. Taehyung set the record down and turned, just thinking. About how easy it is to forget that this, us, wasn't always ours. Jungkook reached up and brushed Taehyung's hair from his face. "We fought for it." "I know," Taehyung leaned into the touch. "Sometimes I still feel like it could all be taken away." "It won't be," Jungkook whispered, "because we won't let it." They stood there for a while, foreheads pressed together, bodies swaying slightly in the quiet rhythm of music and breath. No promises, just presence. As winter deepened, so did their rhythm. Mornings began with shared silences and slow coffee. Afternoons passed in the warmth of studio sessions, where they experimented with sounds and lyrics that blurred the line between art and confession. Evenings curled around them like smoke, movie nights, wine-stained kisses, arguments over whose turn it was to cook, and long talks about everything and nothing. Their home became a sanctuary not from the world but for it. Friends visited often. Namjoon would bring rare books and expensive candles. Jimin would barge in with pastries and gossip, always raising an eyebrow but never a question. Yoongi came with his quiet support, leaning against the wall with a glass in his hand, eyes observant, protective. They weren't just bandmates anymore. They were witnesses to everything, and still they chose to stay. One night snow finally fell. Jungkook woke to the pale shimmer of it outside their bedroom window. The world hushed and knew. He slipped out of bed quietly, padded barefoot through the house, and stood at the window for a long time. Behind him, the soft rustle of sheets and Taehyung's sleepy voice broke the silence. "What time is it?" "Early," Jungkook whispered. "Too early, but it's snowing." A pause. Then the creak of the bed as Taehyung rose, blanket wrapped around his shoulders like a cloak. He came up behind Jungkook and rested his chin on his shoulder, arms sliding around his waist. "It's beautiful," Taehyung murmured. "So are you," Jungkook replied without thinking. Taehyung chuckled sleepily. "You're too soft in the mornings." "No," Jungkook said, turning to face him. "I'm honest in the mornings." Their kiss was slow, familiar like exhaling. That morning they bundled up and walked through the snow-covered trail behind their house. Everything was white and silent, the world suspended. They made snow angels, took photos, sang holiday songs off-key. Jungkook slipped once and dragged Taehyung down with him, both of them laughing so hard their stomachs hurt. The joy was reckless and loud and completely theirs. But even in that stillness, life moved forward. News came of an award they were nominated for, a special recognition for cultural impact. Together, the press called it a symbol of progress, a nod to truth. Some called it overdue, others controversial. Jungkook and Taehyung didn't comment. They only looked at each other the night of the ceremony, hands brushing under the table, hearts beating in tandem. When their names were announced and they walked on stage together, the applause was deafening. But what made Taehyung's throat close and Jungkook's eyes shimmer wasn't the sound, it was the faces in the crowd. The ones who had fought for them, stood beside them, fans holding signs that said your love changed us and we stayed because you did. Taehyung took the mic first. I used to be afraid that showing this part of myself would mean losing everything I worked for, he said, voice steady. But I learned that living a half-truth is a slower kind of loss. Jungkook stepped forward. We didn't plan this, we didn't script it, we just lived it, and we're grateful that you let us. The audience rose to their feet. That night they went home without the after-party, choosing instead to sit on the kitchen floor barefoot, the award between them on the rug untouched. Jungkook poured tea. Taehyung fed the cat. It wasn't glamorous, but it was perfect. As spring came, their relationship settled into something quieter. The headlines faded, the scrutiny dulled. There were still critics, there always would be. But they had long since stopped living for them. Taehyung started painting again, canvas after canvas, colors like emotions he couldn't quite name. Jungkook began composing pieces meant for no one but them. One night, he played a piano melody so soft and aching that Taehyung stood behind him and cried. I don't know why, he whispered, wiping his eyes. You don't have to, Jungkook said, still playing. Just feel it. They talked about the future sometimes. About what it would mean if they ever decided to step back, if they ever tired of the spotlight, if they ever just disappeared. Would you miss it? Taehyung asked once, curled against him on the couch, their fingers entwined. Jungkook thought for a long moment. The music, never the noise, not at all, the connection, always. Me too. They didn't need to plan it. They weren't ready to stop, but the idea of a quieter life didn't scare them anymore. It comforted them. One warm afternoon, Taehyung brought out an old notebook, the one he used to carry before everything, filled with lyrics and poems and drawings no one had ever seen. He handed it to Jungkook without a word. Jungkook flipped through slowly, pausing on a page where a single sentence was scrawled, years old in messy ink. You will always be the song I never finish. He looked up, eyes shining. You finished it, he whispered. Taehyung leaned in, forehead to forehead. We finished it together. That night they danced in the living room to a song that hadn't been released yet, just them. Bare feet on hardwood, candlelight, no audience, no choreography, just movement, just feeling. Love, they had learned, wasn't a performance. It was the quiet decision to stay, to hold space, to keep showing up even when it was hard, especially then. Years from now, long after the world changed again, when fans moved on and the spotlight dimmed, there would still be mornings like this. The smell of tea, the echo of laughter, a hand reaching across the bed, a memory tucked into the corner of a song, a photograph on a piano. Proof that two people, against the odds, found each other in a world built to keep them apart, and chose every single day to stay.